Really pleased to have so many of you here today, so thank you for coming. Thanks real quick to so many people that helped make this happen, from the ESD team who helped set up the room and our IT team who helps with the AV. I almost broke a computer, but that's another story. We thankfully don't need it. Lynn Jors, Cindy Habib, and Rose Field helped make sure that we got fed. And thanks to Dennis Slater in the back, his hospital medical staff, for giving us the funds for our food, and hopefully we will have enough. So Dr. Kombert and Mrs. Joanne Kombert have given this talk a number of times before. Many of you who have heard about it have known that it's pretty powerful. I did ask for an introduction. So Dr. Kombert told me his role, similar to Dr. Namizu's, he's the chief of the hospitals departments at both in the central region, which is both Mid-State Medical Center and Hospital Central Connecticut. And then he said that Joanne has the tough job. She's home with the 4 boys. So I would say that is a tough gig. But I think we have to mention fire exit. This door I know exits out to outside, and then there's 3 different doors on the side, and they exit out to the main lobby, and there's a door out there. And unless I missed anything else, I'll turn it over to Dr. and Mrs. Joanne Kombert.
So I will get started. I want to thank you for allowing us to come here and talk to you today. First, I want to just comment, if you use the flavor shots in the cafeteria, can you put a warning sign up? Just 1 squirt. Because this thing, my sugars have just hit 200. Little error. But anyway, thank you for allowing us to come here today. It means a lot for my wife and I to come and talk about the experience. It's also hard. We've given this talk 7 times. We gave it on Cape Cod. We've given it to almost every region. Almost every, better? Okay.
Thank you.
Almost every region in the system. And it's amazing that the experience we're talking about was 9 years ago. To this day, it's like it was yesterday. So I remember all of it. My wife remembers all of it, because these experiences in a hospital mean so much. They stay with you. But before I get started, I wanted to ask, I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you have been a patient in a hospital over 3 days for a non-elective problem? How many? Good number of people. How many have sat at the bedside of a loved one for that kind of experience? There you go. Every single one of us will experience this at some point in our lives. Every one of us. And I bet you all remember. You all remember what it was like. And our job today is going to talk to you about our experience. Well, what I want you to take away from this is most of you have experienced this. We want to just tell our story. I'm hoping we can help you understand what we went through. Hopefully it'll change how you talk to patients. Because how often, I just thought about this on the ride over today, can you think of any other time in your lives when you handed off your life to someone who you don't know who they are, you don't know what they're doing, but they are responsible for your life? I can only think of one other time. Flying. You walk on a plane, you don't know who that person, that man or woman is, but you're saying, I trust you. You don't even know who they are. Difference is, you walk in that plane electively, and you're normally ending up someplace really nice and warm, and it's a pleasure. In a hospital setting, no one wants to be here. We want to help you to understand that. The second thing that I'm hoping you can take from this is, I don't know the roles of the people in this room. I don't care what your role is. You could be the volunteer at the desk, who was very sweet when we walked in and was very nice. You can be a rad tech, a doctor, a nurse. You can clean the floors, deliver the food, be a pathologist downstairs. It doesn't matter if you think you have any role at all with patients. I promise you, you do. And whether it's because of the work you do or because you walk by them in the hallway, that's when you actually have an interaction with them, and it means something. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So, we're going to get started. So my story, my part of it, starts about 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I'm living on Cape Cod, and I was having GI bleeds. And being the bad doctor for myself, I said, I'll go in, I'll get scoped. They couldn't find anything. I said, it probably won't happen again. First time, second time, third time, it probably won't happen again. Well, it kept happening, and they could not figure it out. And one time, I had a very large bleed, middle of the night, wasn't it? Of course, the kids are asleep upstairs. And I realized I was dizzy. I said, I can't do this anymore. Call the ambulance and they bring me in. Now, I was the VPMA of my hospital at that time. So trust me when I tell you, at 2 o'clock in the morning, when there's no one around, the VPMA gets pulled in and gets into the ED. I'm surrounded by people. I got the greatest care. I had nurses, techs, doctors. They surrounded. My labs were done quickly. Everything was wonderful. But I realized fairly quickly, I cannot do this anymore. I need a higher level of care. We all agreed, got in the ambulance. They took me up to one of the major teaching institutions in Boston. And I'll never forget it, they would wheel me in a stretcher, and there's a woman sitting right at the front desk, and she wheels me and she goes, "Oh, you must be Mr. Kombert." And I said, "I'm not a doctor here, I'm a patient." Trust me, when I was in the hospital the other times, and I was a doctor, I was treated like a doctor. No one else got Wi-Fi, they came in, the IT person came in, gave me Wi-Fi, I got what I needed, but in this hospital I was a patient. And I said, this should be interesting. So I go upstairs, I have a fine night, the next day they get me to the endoscopy suite. It's supposed to be a simple scope, they're supposed to take a look, pull it out, and I'm supposed to be home that night. And they say, "I'm going to give you some Ativan." I said, "Great, I haven't slept in days, give me all you want." Well, lo and behold, I fell asleep, and my story ends right there. And I hand it off.
Okay, my husband, can you hear me in the back, by the way? Okay, he likes to sit. I made a nervous energy. He says it's the Italian in me. I move, so it's a disclaimer in advance. I apologize for dizziness or neck aches, but how I get the words out. So yes, I'm going to pick up in Boston where Danny left off, but I always like to just start out by saying that I am obviously Danny's wife, and I'm a mom to our 4 boys, and I was a nurse, although I've been at home a long time with my boys. But each of these roles that's unique to me, just as each of you have roles that are unique to you, these things affect, how we perceive life situations, how we react, how we problem solve. And I think you'll see here and there how my roles really came out. So, the morning of Danny's scope, I arrived in Boston and I was happy. I was really happy, and you would wonder why. Well, I'll tell you. In my mind, we were in the center of world-class healthcare now. We were in the middle of Boston. So whatever the source of this on-again, off-again bleeding, they were going to find it, they were going to remedy it, and we would go home. We wouldn't have to worry anymore. So I was happy. I was really glad to be there. I walked in and I got myself a cup of coffee, and it was springtime, and Boston is beautiful in springtime. So I went out in the courtyard and I chit-chatted with a man from maintenance for a while, and then time progressed and I hadn't heard anything. They had my cell number, they didn't call. So I went up to the unit and I asked the lady behind the desk if she had heard anything because it was getting late. And she said no. She looked at me a little funny. No information, and would I please go sit in the waiting room? Which of course I did. And this waiting room had one wall, just clear glass, so that you could see right out into the corridor, which led to the unit. So as I'm there, the next thing that I remember seeing was 2 nurses running down the hallway with a 3rd nurse on top of the patient that is on the stretcher that they're pushing, and she's ambooing that patient. And that patient was my husband. And that is how I found out that things did not go very well during his scope. And that was an awful moment. In that moment, I was filled with such a terror. I always describe it as just bone deep. All-encompassing. And it stayed with me for really the better part of those 2 weeks. So I don't know how long I had to wait. I really don't. But eventually, a GI resident came to speak to me, and he had his assistant with him. And let me just set the scene. In the meantime, family members, not ours, family members of another patient had gathered. So there were adults over here laughing and talking, and they had with them small children who were literally bouncing from seat to seat around the waiting room. And with that as the backdrop, with very little compassion and even less privacy, he began to tell me that my husband was bleeding, hemorrhaging. They did not know from where. They couldn't stop it. And oh, by the way, he has lymphoma. And as if I would be as excited as he was at this great find of lymphoma, presented me with the photos that he took of it. I wasn't expecting that, so I wasn't quick enough. I turned my head away, I said no, I pushed the papers away, but I had seen them. And to this day, I cannot look at any image that even remotely resembles those. The same thing happens to me. Yeah, I do this. I'm not squeamish. I'm not that kind of person. As you know, I was a nurse, but more importantly, I'm the mom of 4 boys and 3 dogs. You do not survive in our household if you are a squeamish person. But I can't do it. So time went on, and they decided later that afternoon they had to take Danny to an angio and try and find the source of this bleeding. And his nurse at that time had a couple of choices. She could have said, Mrs. Kombert, take the elevator down to such and such a floor, go left, go right, and you'll find the waiting room. But that's not what she did. Instead, she said, come on, I'm going to show you how to get there. And when we got there, she said, you're going to sit right here, and through those double doors is where your husband's going to be. If you need the restroom, it's there. And if you're thirsty, there's a drinking machine over there. In that moment, that was the kindest thing that anybody could have done for me. If I had gotten lost in the building at that moment, I probably would have lost it. I was maintaining my composure, but I always say with an Olympian effort. It was hard. You have to remember, I was far from home, I was alone, and the one person I would normally turn to in times like that, he was bleeding out through those double doors. So I'm in the waiting room, and I decide this is bad. This is really bad. I go to the desk, and I ask to speak with a priest. And I'm told, no, I'm sorry. They are too busy today. Nobody will be able to see you. Maybe tomorrow. And I'm not, All my life, I've tried to be this good Catholic girl married to this good Jewish boy. We were rebels when we were younger. At the time, that was a really big thing. But the one time I had outwardly asked something of the church, and I was told, no, sorry. So I sat down. I was disappointed. But I really didn't have to wait long before a priest just kind of appeared there beside me. He wasn't in his garb. He was in khakis, and he had on a plaid shirt. He wasn't warm. He wasn't cozy. But he listened to me. He listened to everything I had to say. And when I got finished explaining that my fears of the bleeding were equal to that of the lymphoma, because what good was stopping the bleeding if he was going to die of lymphoma? And he looked at me and he said, sometimes residents, in their excitement at finding something, sometimes they say things that aren't quite accurate or proven. Okay, that's interesting. It didn't necessarily take away my fear. Maybe it just gave me that opportunity to verbalize my fears. Maybe that's all I needed. So the angio determined nothing. And I just happened to ride the elevator back up with one of the doctors involved in the procedure. And I remember very clearly, as he stood in the elevator, he had his back to the buttons, he was in his scrubs, and he just stood there with his head hung. And he looked so dejected, just so not happy. And I thought, oh wow, can it get any worse now? If this guy looks like this, can it possibly get any worse? And then it did, because he offered me what I interpreted to be his condolences. Don't do that. Choose your words and your moments carefully. I wasn't giving up on my husband, and I did not want to feel at all like his healthcare team was giving up on him. So we went back up to the unit, and he bled all through the afternoon and into the evening, throughout the night, and they transfused him afternoon, evening, into the morning, and I just kept asking for them to take him to surgery. And by early morning, they had to. So I was told that The surgeon coming in was fantastic. If I had had my choice, they told me that's who I would have wanted. The nurses even loved him because he wasn't afraid, and this is what they told me, to roll up his sleeves and help with the bedpan. So that mattered too, right? Being a nurse, I'm like, okay, this guy, you know, he digs in there. So he came to speak to me with his chief resident. And this man had what I consider to be some of the key components of a great bedside manner. He was kind, he was calm, and he was confident, not arrogant. There's a difference. And he spoke to me in such a gentle manner. But even though he spoke to me in that gentle manner, he was still able to get across to me everything I needed to hear and understand in order to send my husband off to surgery. And then he was going to have his chief resident speak to me. And although I come from a very large teaching facility in New York, and my husband himself had been a chief resident at that place, I felt the need to tell them that my husband had 4 little boys waiting for him in Cape Cod, and I needed the best, not a resident. And to his credit, he held back the offense. I could see a little bit in his face, but he held it back, and he just wanted to make sure I knew that he was the chief, and he was heading off to Stanford in a couple of weeks. So when he finished speaking to me, I again brought up the lymphoma concerns. And that chief resident, he looked at me and kind of cocked his head just so, and crinkled his nose, and let me know he didn't necessarily agree with that diagnosis of lymphoma. It had never occurred to me to doubt it. GI didn't say, we think he has lymphoma, maybe he has lymphoma. He said he has it, and here are my pictures to prove it. Now, in case you hadn't noticed, I hung on every word and every facial and body expression, because until that moment, I had had nothing else to hang on to. I really loved that resident because he wasn't afraid to break ranks and tell me what he thought. You wouldn't, maybe not everyone would agree with me on that he disagreed with someone in front of me, but it made a difference. It gave me something to hold on to. So he went off to surgery, and however many hours later, I couldn't tell you, I don't think I even knew that day how many hours went by. But I was in a very large waiting room. In my mind, it wasn't a typical waiting room. It was really big. And say I was seated in the far back corner of this room, and those two, the surgeon and his resident, entered when they were done through that area. And when they focused in on me across that really big room, when they saw me, they gave me the biggest, most genuinely joyful smiles. And in that moment, I knew that my world was not coming to an end. Bless their hearts, they weren't into drama, you know, they weren't into suspense. So then they took me into a private room to tell me what had gone on, and what had gone on was Danny had had an AV malformation that when biopsied, hemorrhaged. So the bleeding was stopped. There was no lymphoma, right off the table. I couldn't have asked for a better outcome than that. You know, it was an amazing moment. But he wasn't out of the woods yet. His body had taken such a hit. He was in an induced coma in the unit. And unfortunately, this phase of his care did not go quite as smoothly as they had hoped it would. So in the unit, he had a nurse beside him at all times. There were tubes everywhere, and it was scary. It was frightening for me. And that was not an unfamiliar scene to me. But when it's your husband or your family member, as a lot of you probably know, when it's them in that bed, it's just a whole different ballgame. I remember just reaching in to kiss his lips and, you know, to move the tubes. It was like going through a briar patch. I knew what I was doing with those tubes, but can you imagine someone who, first of all, has never seen anything like that before, and then maybe they're really brave enough to steal a kiss, and they lean in and they touch a tube, and coincidentally an alarm goes off at the same time. I mean, that'll scare the pants off you if you don't know what's going on. So, you know, it's scary. It's scary for everybody. So the nurses and doctors at this phase of his care were phenomenal. They were outstanding. They were the best. And they were great communicators. They spoke to me. I made it clear I didn't want to be treated as though I knew anything, because my head was foggy. Things that on a good day would have been a simple concept for me were not so simple at that point in my life. Sometimes I had to have them repeat things to me. I never felt any judgment from anyone if I was struggling with giving approval for something or having it re-explained. They were really good about that. They spoke to Danny. They didn't speak over him. They spoke to him. They explained what they were doing. Now, I can only speak for the nurses in this room, but I know every one of you was taught that you speak to your patient, not over them, whether you think they can hear you or not. And they did that. I remember there was one day when I arrived at the unit and his nurse met me at the door. That was unusual. She immediately said to me, "He's okay, everything is fine," but earlier that morning he had braided down. I knew what that meant, but she said to me, they saw it, they treated it, and he's doing okay. She said all of this to me in the time it took for us to walk together slowly down the hall to the entrance to his cubicle, so that by the time I reached the entrance, it was a done deal, and I could go on with my day and face whatever challenges I was going to maybe face that day. When you're going through something like that, little acts of kindness, you learn very quickly, make a big difference. I always knew little acts of kindness mattered. My mother taught me well. I incorporated it into my life. I still do, to strangers or people I know. But I don't think until you're truly desperate, little extra things that people do to go out of their way, until you're desperate, you don't fully appreciate how much that matters. So, it's not just doctors and nurses who make a difference in a patient and family members' experience in the hospital. I want to tell you about the unit clerk on Danny's unit, who every day when I arrived would greet me with just a lovely smile and some sort of kind words. It's kind of like she knew that when I stepped outside those unit doors, take a deep breath, and I'd have to push myself forward because my legs felt like weights, my chest was tight, because no matter how much I wanted to get through those doors to see my husband, I was terrified of what I was going to face that day. For so many days, there had been very little good news. He had fevers, they thought he re-bled a few times, and they couldn't wean him from the vent. So her kind words helped me get down that hallway a little bit easier. I want to tell you about the lady in security that he referenced, calling her Mr. Kombert, who every day when I arrived would ask me how my husband was doing. It's a big lobby there. There's a lot of people. There was a day she even called over the heads of the people at the desk with her just to see how things were going. That mattered to me. I want to tell you, very much so, about the cashier in the parking garage, who maybe we don't always think about in regards to these issues. Every night when I would go out, he would ask me how things were progressing. And he showed such genuine concern when he could see I was coming and going for so many days. That mattered to me. It also mattered because although I consider myself a tough little Italian from New York, I was afraid to go alone into a parking garage in the middle of Boston at 10:30 at night because he cared enough to notice I knew I was not alone. I also would like to tell you about the lovely gentleman from housekeeping who swept Danny's floors, who emptied the trash. He could not speak much English, but he still found a way to let us know that he cared about us and our 4 boys, whose pictures the nurses so literally perfectly placed on the wall in that room. His presence when he was in there with me, it was so comforting. Now, I want to tell you about 2 big, tough, burly guys from transport. Well, when I couldn't spend my time on the unit with Danny, I would spend my time in a long corridor right outside. It had clear glass walls on each side. It connected 2 buildings. And as I said, it was springtime in Boston. So I could be in that area and see all the beautiful trees that were in full bloom. And because I shook and shivered for the better part of those 14 days, the sunlight that came in through that window would warm me. It felt so good. And while I was there, I walked. I walked back and forth, back and forth. I lost 10 pounds in 2 weeks. I walked a lot of miles. Well, those two big tough guys from transport every day would go find me a chair and bring it and put it just out of the way in case that day I wanted to sit. They did that every day without fail, except for once. And that day the hospital was so busy, there wasn't a chair to spare. What did they do? They found a wheelchair. And I didn't sit in it, but it's the thought that counts, really. It was very, very sweet. Well, when the time came for Danny to leave the unit and go to a regular floor bed, these two guys were the ones to transport him. And I remember that day, in the hallway, it was silent. I mean, there was no one around. It was just us. There were no dings, no buzzes, no overhead announcements. It was just us. And one of those big, tough guys looked down at Danny in that bed and said to him, "She's been waiting a long time for you." And I had. And it was such a beautiful moment, like such a human moment. And he got it, you know, and I think of that often. It means a lot to me. So yes, eventually he was able to come off the ventilator. And I thought when that day came, it would be like, you know, this wonderful reunion, you know, like we hadn't seen each other in ages, and we hadn't, really. But it was horrible. It was terrible, let me tell you, because the last he knew, you know, he was going in for a scope. It's now 14 days later. So much had gone on. And while he was in that induced state, he had, whether you call it dreams, nightmares, hallucinations, whatever they were, he had them, and they were terrible. And when he woke, he was not able to figure out what was reality because they seemed so real. What was reality and what wasn't. And it was awful to see him go through it. So at this point, we had a new nurse, not new, just new to us. And I said to her, you know, I'm concerned because he's so confused. I'm afraid he's going to get hurt. I have a feeling. And she said to me, "Oh no, he'll be fine. I can see him and he's got the bells on the bed. Don't worry about it. Go home." And I thought, don't give it away.
Should have stayed.
Should have stayed. So I went home and I made my usual 3 a.m. phone call. And when she heard me on the end of the phone, what I heard from her was, "Mrs. Kombert, I'm such a bad nurse." What? Like, who says that? I mean, really? So what had happened was, in his confused state, he went over one end of the bed, and anything that was attached to him was left behind. Not a good moment. So when I arrived later in the morning, at my regular time, seated in the corner of his room was a lovely elderly woman, a sitter. You knew it, asleep. She was asleep. So the next day when I arrived, there was a lovely young gentleman who was awake, who loved to text or whatever we were doing on our phones back then. And he was the sitter that accompanied us when we went to our regular floor bed. And when we arrived at our new unit, the nurse that greeted us was not warm, and she was not welcoming. And she stayed about as far away as she possibly could. Maybe it was because he had a sitter. Maybe she was intimidated because he was a doctor. Not good enough. So he was left to the sitter. But you might be thinking that maybe I was spoiled, right? Because I'd been on the unit for so long and we had such close attention. But remember, I've worked on all kinds of units. I fully appreciate that floor nurses cannot, nor should they, give the same amount of time to their patients. It's just not necessary. But she didn't do her job. And because I know all of that, I know how much she was capable of giving. I say she, could have been a he, but it was a she that time, so don't think I'm leaving anybody out. I knew what she was capable of giving, and she just didn't do it. So, Danny wanted a nice hot shower. I think he was due one after 14 days, right? So his very first time out of bed, unattended, the sitter allowed him to take a nice hot shower. as the sitter sat out in the room. While in the shower, Danny collapsed. And he stayed that way until he was able to drag himself back to bed. At this point, I'm done. That's it, no more. I pushed hard and they let me take him home early. Believe me, he could barely walk a few steps, truly. But I could keep him safer at home with me. I want you to know, after saying all of that to you, that my positive experiences far outweigh my negative experiences. And I will be eternally grateful to all of those people that we interacted with during that whole experience. I know I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. I know you do all these really good things every day. And I also know that people don't always say thank you. Even the ones you have a really great rapport with, you don't always get the note saying thank you. Or the pastry tray, your unit, and gratitude. Here's why. Here's why I think. Because when they leave you, they're done. They just want to go home. They want to forget it. They don't want to look back. Most of them never want to come in a hospital again. I felt that way so much so that on our way home to Cape Cod from Boston, in that crazy Boston traffic, someone hit us from behind. I did not get out to check the damage. I did not even stop the car. I kept going. Nothing was going to stop me. I didn't know. I probably broke a law, but I promise you, at the time, I did not know I was doing that. I just wanted to go home, and we did. So again, your patients and their families, they are grateful for all that you do. Just please always remember that what you say and how you say it and what you do and how you do it can bring someone through their darkest hour, or you can bring them to their knees. Thank you.
So if you don't think that the experiences that people have in the hospital impact them 5, 10, 20 years down the road, I saw such a problem hearing the story. It is so hard to think that she had to deal with all of this because I was the one sitting in bed and I couldn't help her. It's still very, very difficult. But I woke up, I did, and the hallucinations were horrific. I remember them today like they're memories. To me they were. And I was horribly confused. And I want to tell you a little bit about some of the things that I learned and how I changed, how I practice based on my stay. I've gone in with residents to rooms with nurses, and we tell patients and their families what's going on and what the issues are, and we're there for them. But something about leaving the room and crossing the threshold, I think we think a cage comes down or some kind of cone of silence comes down, and what you say in the hallway, no one can hear, because I was bored out of my mind. I had no TV, I couldn't read a book, so I listened. I listened to everything. I heard about who had cancer down the hall. I heard about whose wife was being difficult because she was asking too many questions. I heard about the difficult nurses, the difficult doctors. I heard about, and this was hard for me, I heard about what people were doing on the weekends and how much fun they were going to have tonight. And I have to tell you, I want camaraderie in a hospital. I want everyone talking and socializing. I promise you, there are places for that. And being a person who had a picture of my boys in front of me, and I wanted to go home desperately, hearing all the things, all the laughter outside my room, I don't know how other patients feel, it hurt. Because I'm sitting here and I can't deny it. I was saying to myself, how can they be laughing when I'm so sick in this bed right now, where I'm in such agony? I ask you to take the conversations away from the room. And I want you to know, when they would talk about the cancer right outside my room, in my confused state, what do you think I was thinking? They must be talking about me. What is my wife not telling me? So I ask, please, there are always great places to talk. Outside the rooms, we can't hear everything. And more importantly, we're listening. Because what else are we doing? I had some positive experiences, but I'm telling you about some negative ones because it taught me how to talk to patients. When I first got up, I had been paralyzed for 2 weeks. So they said, Dan, we're going to get you up today. And I said, great. And they swung my legs over, and I had a nurse on each side of me. And what is I'm arrogant, confident, I don't know. But I stood right up, and I went right down, all right? I had no strength. They grabbed me, and they put me, I had to go to the bathroom, so they put me on the commode. I could hardly sit. So what did they do? I had a male nurse holding my right arm so I wouldn't fall over, and I had another nurse who went to the other side of the bed and was making the bed. 10 years ago, I remember it like it was yesterday. I was put on a commode with 2 people standing right there with me. If that's not humiliating and dehumanizing, I can't think what is. One of the reasons I mention this is, what else are they supposed to do? They have to be there. What should they do? What did they choose to do? They spoke over my head to each other. They were talking about a problem nurse from the night before who, because of what she did, it doesn't matter what she did, it was making their day really hard. They had a lot of work they had to catch up on. As I'm sitting there, there's no way to describe it. It's just I felt it just dehumanizing. I felt humiliated. And I don't know, maybe they were trying to do that so their focus was off me so I could do what I had to do. I understand that. But I have to tell you, what it made me feel like is that they didn't care about me at all. This was a task. I got to do what I have to do, and then we're going to put you back in bed. It was hard for me. So I ask you all to remember about the respect that we're looking for as patients. Sometimes you don't even realize, and my wife said it, sometimes you say things, you don't realize how people are taking it. That was hard for me. And I want you to know, they were saying how bad their day was. I promise you, I don't care if you get a flat tire coming to work, you get into a fight with your spouse, if you're not feeling well yourself, my day was worse than theirs. And you know what I want? What I wanted from everyone who walked into my room? I'm sorry if you had a bad day, but come into my room, you smile, you put your hand on my shoulder, you ask me how things are going, you tell me everything's going to be okay. Because that's what I need as a patient. And we're always taught, leave it outside the hospital. I can't tell you how much more that means to me now. Leave it outside the hospital. I need you at your best in the room, because when you walk in and you're not smiling, I have 2 things. Either I think you're having a really bad day, or you know what I really think? I'm causing you problems. You don't want to be there. I am calling you too often. I have to go to the bathroom again. I'm sorry. But when you walk in, everyone does it. You internalize it. What did I do to make them so unhappy? So that's really important. I want to tell you about my doctor. So 9 years ago, he walks into my room at the very end of my stay. And what does he do? He pulls up a chair and he sits down. This is a trauma surgeon, busy man. He sits down and he goes through my stay. And he tells me what happened. He asks, what questions do you have for me? And I ask him some questions. Then he shakes my hand and he thanks me for allowing him to help care for me. And he gets up and he leaves. To this day, what do I remember? I remember he had time for me. I remember he sat down. Because by sitting down, I said, oh, he's not rushing out. He really wants to talk to me. I think he was probably there 5 minutes, maybe less. But it felt like he was there in an eternity because all my questions were answered. But he sat down. I can't tell you how important that was to me. I talked before about everyone plays a role. Everyone in the hospital. You know, when you walk by someone in the hall and they're lost and you say, how can I help you? They remember that. If you see somebody crying outside of a room and you walk up and say, how can I help you? Do you want tissues? Can I call someone for you? They remember that. To you, I promise you, it's a 30-second conversation. You walk away and take care of another 100 patients. You don't remember who these people are. I promise you, they remember who you are. Look at my wife. They won't know who she was if she went back to that hospital. She remembers every one of them 10 years later. Here's the hard part, though. If you walk down the hall using your iPhone and you're texting and someone looks lost and you walk right by them, or more importantly, someone's crying in the hallway, and we've all been there, and you're like, okay, I could stop, and it might take me 10 minutes, and I'm really busy, I have a place to go. So you're on your phone and you just sort of walk right by. They remember that too. They remember no one helped them. Instead of getting the positive feedback that Bacchus is wonderful, they all stopped. What they're going to remember, what they'll tell their friends is, they didn't care. They kept walking. Everyone, and I mean, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're in the patient room or not, anyone can say hello when they walk by. Anyone can interact with somebody who needs help, and it makes an enormous difference. You know, it's important that you understand the L&M is your competition down south, right? I had asked Jen before. They use, believe it or not, the exact same antibiotics we use. They use the same IV fluids. They use the same treatments. I can get treated for pneumonia there just like I can here. Pretty well. The difference is the experience. How you talk to me, how you look at me, how you make me feel when I walk in, how you're a volunteer when I walk in, smiles and says hello to me. I love that. All right? That makes the difference. That's what determines whether I want to come back here or I want to go to L&M. It's not the antibiotic. I don't know what they were giving me in the IV bags. What mattered to me was how you talk to me, the experience. That makes the difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. Really powerful talk. We certainly want to hear if anyone has any questions or any thoughts that they want to share. I have a microphone. I have one, I know. Because I don't even want to ask how hard this was, but you have 4 boys at home in Cape Cod, and you were at that hospital every day. What was that like? How did you have people helping you?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I did have my parents there taking care of them, but it was really hard because I would leave, I'd get my kids off to school, and I would head up to Boston, and I would come home late at night, and I wanted to be involved. So in those early morning times, I would be doing my thing. That was my time to really spend, to make sure everything was done, to help with the laundry, to help with the dogs. But it was hard. I remember one time, I'm not very good with electronics. So on my voicemail on my phone was my husband's voice. And one of my little boys at the time was having trouble remembering Daddy's voice. And so she had called my phone, and said, don't pick it up now, because she just wanted him to hear his voice over there. So even though they didn't really know what was going on, Dad wasn't there, but it was hard, to hear the voice. But that was really hard doing that, having the kids there and having my parents and coming and going. It was very stressful.
Absolutely.
How old were your boys at that time?
Oh, gosh. Well, it's really funny that I would say I don't know, because I choose not to I don't know why. I choose not to remember the year that this happened in, so I rely on him to tell me how. I know that sounds really silly. So I think they were like in 1st grade, preschool, or maybe like 2nd or 3rd grade first. Yeah, I know.
9975 probably.
Yeah, I know that's really crazy, but I just don't look up the year, so I don't really know. I just know they were little, and I remember the particular book reports that were going on, the frog and the lily pad, and I remember all that, but I couldn't tell you the ages or the years. That's crazy.
You guys have any other thoughts, or anyone else have any thoughts? I know that we all come here to take really good care of our patients, but this was a fantastic reminder of the impact that we have, because we all do have a bad day. And none of us would want our bad day to impact negatively on one of our patients, but I just thought I changed the way I practice from hearing this talk when it was at Patient Experience up in Hartford, and I said to Dan, I admittedly didn't even hear the entire thing. What struck me was that comment about the conversations, how it's completely innocuous sometimes for us to care about each other and just check on each other, yet to hear how upsetting it was. I think you said you couldn't get out of bed and all you wanted to do was see your boys, and you had to hear about all the fun that everybody else was doing. So I'm personally very impacted by that, and will never forget it. And just want to thank you again. You drove all the way down to Bacchus from Simsbury. Yeah, so that's a good commute. And I just want to thank all of you. You were so attentive. Hopefully everyone had enough to eat. And thank you all very much for coming. So.